Whether you're new to information security as a security professional or you've been doing it for quite some time, your participation in the process of security testing and evaluation, well, that's paramount. That's one of the most important aspects to the job. And it can take different forms depending upon where you are in the organization and how your organization behaves. The idea here is that you have an understanding of the frameworks and the processes to evaluate things like assets, the threats that are out there, the vulnerabilities, and the controls that you can use as part of your risk treatment. Now, you might be responsible for doing all of it. In other words, within your particular area, you might be the one that does all, that discovers all the assets, inventories the assets, determines what threats are out there that could affect those assets, what additional vulnerabilities those assets may have. And you might be the one that needs to evaluate and test a variety of controls that can reduce or mitigate those vulnerabilities. Or you might be responsible for just one piece of this. You just might be responsible for a while at testing controls. So this is a many faceted kind of thing. And what I want to do is make sure you have the frameworks behind you to back it up and then give you some real risk analysis scenarios that we can work with here. Now, to make sure that you have the frameworks, first of all, we have to bring in some of the standards organizations that create these frameworks. And so the International Organization of Standards, the International Electrotechnical Commission, ISO, the 27,000 series is a series of documents. And matter of fact, you can go out to your favorite search engine if you want to and bring this series of documents up. There's quite a few of them. And the idea is that they are going to provide some of the best practices on things like security management, risk management, selection of controls and they'll label this as the Information Security Management System, ISMS. This is your system that you have in place for all of your management. Now, before you just go running out there to read all of them, there's quite a few of them that are out there. Let me kind of dial you in on some that are particularly useful for us right now. So the ISO 27002 particular documents, that's a code of practices and guidelines for IT security management. And in general, I think what you'll find really useful to take a gander at is ISO 27005. This is the one that's focused on risk management, and it covers things that we've already talked about. So this is going to look really familiar to you. It's going to talk about risk assessments, risk treatment, things like, risk acceptance, communication, who do you communicate to, and monitoring of your assessments. So this is information, a great place to kind of go in for more detailed information on the things that we've already talked about. But these ISO documents, they're good. Don't get me wrong, they are very good. I oftentimes go towards the NIST documents. As a matter of fact, this one in particular, NIST SP 800-37 Rev 1, we're going to spend quite a bit of time with here right at the very beginning. This is a more practical approach to risk management. And let me just tell you the reason why is that the ISO documents are great, but they're very general. In other words, they cover a wide variety of organizations. Well, the federal government, the United States federal government, needed some more practical approaches for itself. And that's what the NIST documents provide. And these practical approaches oftentimes give you better information when you're looking at your own risk management process. And so having the NIST approach is a little bit more detailed. And so that's really the document I'm going to encourage you to take a look at. And there's a couple of things in particular that we want to spend some time with. First of all, take a look at the tiered risk management approach. Now, don't panic. I bet you're going to find that you're already more familiar with this than you might think. Remember we were talking about the enterprise management that you wanted to try to bring into an organization, or an organization should try to adopt? Here's the documentation, more detailed documentation on that. So SP 800-37 Rev 1 provides this information. And by the way, there at the very bottom of the screen is a link to the document, or you just go to your favorite search engine and go ahead and type it in. What they've done is they've broken this down into 3 tiers in the NIST document for their approach to how the organization can bring in risk management. And this is going to seem very familiar. Let me break these 3 tiers out for you, starting with tier number 1. So tier number 1 is the actual organizational level. This is where the governance is created. So what kind of things do we need here? These are going to be where we decide on the techniques and methodologies that the organization is going to employ. So this is deciding on what frameworks we're going to use, and also on the methods that we're going to use to evaluate identified risks. And that's one of the things that we're going to dive more into in this module. Now, what kind of mitigation measures are we going to take? And we talked about this with treatments. There's different types of mitigation we can do. It could be reduction, it could be acceptance, it could be avoidance. And as far as the organization goes, the organization needs to make decisions on what ones are we going to use and under what criteria. So if we're going to accept a risk, we first need to make sure that the organization will only accept risks that are, have, a very low percentage of being able to, of occurring. So we also then want to look at that level of risk acceptance. And that's how we're kind of tying these two together. Also, monitoring practices. How are we going to make sure that the decisions that we're making at the organizational level are being fulfilled, that they're being executed the way we anticipated? And that then turns to the degree of oversight. Through this monitoring, to make sure the decisions that we made are being executed, who's in charge of this process? Who needs to make sure that this is occurring the way that we wanted to? Now, at the organizational level, that's where these decisions of both the policies and the procedures and the methodologies that we're going to use are made. Tier 2 is where we need to make some statements on the business process or the business mission that's involved. So we need to define what the core mission is. We don't know what to protect for the business if we don't understand what the business process is. In other words, I could have an application that I spend a tremendous amount of time of discovering its vulnerabilities and figuring out what its mitigation strategies are going to be, but it's an application that isn't used or that isn't part of the business, of the mission of the business itself. So we need to define those things so we're focused on the right things at the right time. And then define the information that the organization needs to maintain. And I'm just going to bring back in the whole concept of the CIA triad. And so we're thinking about the data that the organization needs. What's confidential? What do we need to make sure that we're maintaining integrity on, that we have availability for? Some information that the organization has isn't actually necessary to the business process or to achieving the mission goals for the business. That information, we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it until we've gotten the important stuff taken care of. So you can see that these definitions are very important. That's how we develop our protection strategy. Now we know where to focus our strength, where we're going to focus all of our time and efforts in order to be able to clean this up. And then it comes to tier 3. And this is where a lot of us like to operate. And this is where we will then go in, identify the risks and look at the mitigation procedures and make the selection of the controls and safeguards that we're going to put in place. And this also will involve the monitoring process that will tie back into the oversight that is going on for all 3 tiers. Now, as we talked about with the enterprise management concept for risk management, this is a much more detailed definition of that. So if you dive into the document, you can see it. Now, right after this, inside of SP 800-37, they start to talk about the risk management framework. And this is the steps to go through for your risk management process. And I remember as a young IT professional, the first time I went through this, and it seemed like it was a lot, but I think you'll see that from all of the work that we've done so far in this course, it starts to make sense as a reiterative process now for our risk management. And so it starts with going through a 6-step process. And I'm going to break these down a little bit. But step 1 is categorize. Then we go to select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. So let's break this down. And there's the location of the document. We'll break this down a little bit more. So first of all, to categorize. So we're going to collect information on our systems and our threats. As we've said, we need to know what assets are out there and what kind of threats will affect those assets and what kind of vulnerabilities are out there. Once we do that, we can then select, or in this case, identify the controls that we're going to use to mitigate those vulnerabilities and to prevent those threats as best we can from occurring. Now, this is where we're going to start to need to tailor this for our, specific types of business and what we're trying to protect. This is part of, and this is why it ties into that first part where the organization has to make some decisions about is it that we're going to protect and what are the mission critical things. And we have to understand about the business more so that we know that we are selecting the proper controls for the proper, threats that we're trying to save the organization from. Then step 3 is once we've selected those controls, we need to look at the implementation of them. And this is the implementation process. Some controls, like a firewall, requires that it be installed, configured, tested. Some controls may not be the installation of hardware, they may be the installation of software, or it may be a procedural control. If this event occurs, then do this is the control that we're going to do. It may be a written process that we're going to implement. So it's the implementation phase. And this will have all of the decisions that we've also made about alternatives, the cost to this, and the risk of trade-offs. If we decided to use a cheaper control versus a more expensive one, what trade-offs are we looking at? Or if we decided that we decided to do risk acceptance, what is the trade-off that we're looking at? Step 4 is going to be then to assess, and that is, did the control or our implementation, let's put it that way, did it perform as expected? Is it working the way that we thought that it would work? And this includes making sure that we're still in line with the cost that we thought we would spend for it. Did the implementation process work as expected? And is the control performing correctly? Now, once we do that, then we need to report information to the authorizing officials. And this simply is part of that communication stage where we make sure that the people that are supposed to be responsible for making sure that the organization is following its risk management, that we're giving that information to them to show that it is occurring. And it also gives us an opportunity to make sure that we have great documentation on the first 4 steps. And then step 6 is monitor. And this is going to be where we're monitoring, again, the effectiveness of the controls. Really, we're looking for if there's any changes to the system, because as soon as there's a change made to the system, and remember the last course, we talked about change management. If there's a change to the system, that suddenly means we may have opened up other vulnerabilities, that we've added additional risk, that we might need to make sure that we're still compensating, that we have controls for those. And also, we might be monitoring for particular federal guidelines that we need to follow as well. Now, one thing I want to remind you about is that it's not that we do these 6 steps and then stop. No, it's that we do these 6 steps and we go right back to the first step. That's part of, monitoring the effectiveness and changes to the system right there. Changes to the system sends us right back to step 1. If any change occurs, let's categorize, find out what threats are available. Then we go back to selecting it, implementing, assessing, authorizing, and monitoring again. So this is an important framework to follow through. Now, each company can implement their own. However, it's great to have this documentation. And it's good for you to go through and actually kind of read through this documentation because it's a great place to start. I remember I myself, the first time I had to do this with a company, this is where we started. And then we built our processes then around this. And so it's very helpful to give you guidance and guidelines for it. But you know what? I think we should kind of take this and do our own risk analysis and start to drill into some of the calculations that we can do and tie this all together. So we have the frameworks now. Now let's start to do the actual testing and work for all of this.